Even being Mexican American is a unique experience, right? I mean, we have a unique history in this country that goes back hundreds of years. You know, the people who founded San Antonio, the people who founded Albuquerque, the people who founded LA, they never left. Those people stayed. And those are our ancestors. And so that's why we have a unique experience that other Latin Americans don't share. And I think Puerto Ricans have their own unique experience with the United States, certainly. The Cubans to a certain degree because of, you know, the Spanish-American War, but Mexican Americans on the mainland have a very unique experience. And I think that identity has never gone away. We've always been here.
Okay, so this is a good segue into our final topic, which is just identity in general. You know, it's one thing to debate Latinx, Chicano, Mexican American, but somebody asked earlier about the word Hispanic, which is a whole nother can of worms. You work with a foundation. I forget what the name of it is.
The Hispanic Heritage Project.
Hispanic Heritage Project, right? And you don't necessarily have a problem with looking into or learning more about the Spanish side that a lot of us have, whether or not we want to admit it, right? Because we're all mestizos. A lot of us are mestizos.
Right, we're
not as pure as we think we are.
Right, exactly. Some of us have more indigenous ancestry. Some of us have more Spanish ancestry. It culminates into a a shared experience, right? But yeah, it's worth exploring, no matter what your background is or what part of Mexico you're from. So what I do with the Hispanic Heritage Project is we are a nonprofit. And we go to Mexico. We're trying to expand to other parts of Latin America, but right now we're really focused on Mexico. We go to colonial era archives. Now in Mexico, you have to remember, we were part of the Spanish Empire for 300 years, okay? Mexico has only been an independent country for 200 years. The Aztec Empire was only around for 200 years, but we were part of the Spanish Empire for 300 years. And I think a lot, just because of the way we've shaped our identity post-independence and especially post-revolution, we've sort of erased a lot of that historical memory. We don't really talk about it. We don't think about it, especially here. If you've ever gone through the whole like Chicano studies circuit, you go straight from like conquest of Mexico straight to independence, and you kind of skip over a lot of this important stuff. So in Mexico, there's almost 3,000 historical archives, and there are millions upon millions of documents. Each one of these documents, have an incredible amount of data, incredible amount of information that has yet to be explored. A lot of it has been explored. Mexico, you have to remember, like, if you think of being quote unquote mestizo or mixed as like its own sort of ethnicity, we're one of the only ethnicities in the world that its entire existence has coincided with writing, right? So the existence of like the process of miscegenation and mixing between Spanish and indigenous people and even African folks, if you have that in your ancestry, that's been recorded since the beginning of time of us as mixed people. It's a very interesting topic to explore and learn about your ancestors and see when they got married.
If there's okay, let me ask you a question. So if there's so much documentation that exists, that's why don't more people know about it? And where do people access it at?
There are folks, a good number of folks, genealogists included, that do this research, archival research in Mexico. So it does exist. Almost exclusively the information's in Spanish. So you have to be able to, that's one layer. If you're Mexican American, you have to be able to read Spanish to read like really good content. But then two, I think especially here in the United States and even in Mexico, there's a lot of politics involved in talking about the colonial period. People can't really see past the narratives that have been shaped around it. And so, you have ideas, people have ideas that like we were all enslaved at some point in our history, which is not true probably for most Mexicans. I know that kind of turns reality upside down for people when they hear that kind of stuff. Another thing, you have to remember, I think we were talking about this during the break, the colonial system, they had a government, right? There was a system of cities and districts and kingdoms. Central Mexico was actually its own kingdom in the Spanish Empire. A lot of people don't know that. And all of these governments had, administrators, people who worked, bureaucrats, people who worked for the system. Those people never left. Okay. Like for a lot of us, those are our ancestors. These folks that were, generals, captains in the military that served, that people that went to go conquer the Philippines. The people who conquered the Philippines on behalf of the Spanish Empire were people born in Mexico. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff just turns reality on its head, and it's hard for people to grapple with that. And a lot of people don't even approach Mexican history in that way. So they don't even know that these resources are available. One, they don't go looking for them because they have a different perception of history. And then two, they just don't know these documents exist. Maybe it's a language barrier, or there's not enough discussion on this stuff.
Now, one of the more fascinating things I've heard you talk about that a lot of people don't realize, because people tend to take a very purist approach, right? They're either indigenous or they're mestizo. You're good or you're evil, or you're one or the other. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And you've talked about there's actually alliances that existed between certain indigenous communities and the Spanish.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of
that's mind blowing though to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of us, when we do when we've at least done some of the good basics on Mexican history, we do know about like the Tlaxcalans, right, who joined with Cortez. I mean, it wasn't just the Tlaxcalans. I mean, there were several tribes that joined Cortez in the conquest of Tenochtitlan. So, but at the very least, you probably heard about that. But this process of alliance building never ended. It never ended. And so right after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs surrendered. Cuauhtemoc, better known as the Mexicas, the more accurate term is the Mexicas. I'm going to use Aztec just because that's a word that most people know, but the more accurate term would be Mexica. So the Aztecs, they actually formed an alliance with Cortez after the conquest. So the Aztecs were conquered about 500 years ago on August 13th, 1521. And shortly thereafter, they formed an alliance with Cortez. Cortez reinstated many titles of nobility back to Aztec leadership. And these titles of nobility, okay, these were pre-Hispanic titles of nobility that were recognized by the Spanish government. They were eliminated by the Mexican government in 1824. So these titles of nobility existed for 300 years during the Spanish Empire. Some of them still exist actually in Spain. There are people who are descendants of Moctezuma who live in Spain. There are descendants in Mexico who live in Mexico. Those titles were invalidated. And so after that, the Aztecs helped to form an alliance with the Purépechas. That's where my family's from, Michoacán. So the Purépechas never actually went to war with the Spaniards. The Aztecs helped to broker a peace treaty. And the Purépechas, they probably saw like the writing on the wall, and they decided for the good of their community, they refrained from fighting. They ended up joining together with the Spaniards, and they ended up helping to conquer Jalisco. So Jalisco was, there was a lot of Chichimeca tribes there. There were the Tecuaches. There were folks that were hostile indigenous groups that the Purépechas didn't like either. Okay, they did not like. These groups would make incursions into Michoacán and attack communities. So they saw the Spaniards as a way. They just saw Tenochtitlan get smashed, and they said, okay, well, if you can't beat them, join them. But they joined together with the Spaniards and went to go conquer Jalisco. And when I say joined together, I mean it was in a significant way. There were 8,000 indigenous warriors, and like half of them were Purépechas, and the other half were Tlaxcalans. 8,000 indigenous warriors that joined somewhere like a little over 150, somewhere between 150 and 300 Spaniards. Okay, so we're talking more than 90% of the Spanish armed forces at that moment. That was in like 1529, 1530. From that moment on, and for much of the rest of the Spanish Empire, more than 90% of the armed forces were Native Americans. The Purépechas and the Tlaxcalans were the majority of the people who were on the boats that went to go conquer the Philippines. So we're talking the people who conquered the Philippines in like 1565, they were Tlaxcalans and Purépechas, along with like some Mexican-born criollos. So, I mean, you never hear this stuff. You never hear this stuff. And however you feel about imperialism, right? I mean, nobody likes imperialism. However you feel about that stuff, these are still our ancestors. You know, my great grandmother was Purepecha. So these are still our ancestors. When you start digging into the reality behind it, you see how the nation building process of Mexico unfolded. And it's not what the popular narratives say it is. And you really see it come to life when you do genealogy, because you take yourself out of the narratives and you just see what was my family doing at that time. Like, for example, I found my first Spanish ancestor that ever came from Spain to go to Michoacan was a man named Juan de Baeza. And he became the first Purepecha Spanish interpreter in history. And I actually got a copy of his document. I got it from an archive in Pátzcuaro. And it's all documented. It's all there. And that's why I've been sharing this with the world. It's a very exciting experience to just learn a little bit more about yourself in a very personal way.
I do think it's interesting. We're in a spot right now. So I love history in general, and I've always been able to separate myself from my politics in terms of just being fascinated by the past. I'm not put off by the fact that I have Spanish in me, probably like a lot of people. I don't know all the details, but I'm fascinated. I think they all have interesting histories. And we're kind of in a place in society right now where anything that has to do with Spain is equated to being evil. And you're saying it's more complicated than that, and that our backgrounds and our bloodlines and our heritage and our histories are more complicated than just black or white, Indigenous versus Spanish.
Right, right. My approach is this. You will always hear people trying to get you to hate one side or the other, okay? You will always get political extremists on both sides who will say, oh, you can't like anything that's Spanish. Or people say, oh, well, you know, it's the indigenous people, blah, blah, blah. You will always get extremists on both sides. At least give it a chance. See where your ancestors were working together. Just give it a chance, because it might make you feel whole. If there's something that you feel like you need to know more about yourself, it became so liberating when I started doing genealogy, because in a very real sense, I saw my ancestors working together rather than constantly at war with each other. Because there's a lot more that happened after 1521. And what you find in your ancestry might surprise you. I mean, and this is literally all parts of Mexico. You know, my wife's family's from Oaxaca. The Zapotecs and the Mixtecs helped. They allied with the Spaniards, and there were more indigenous people that were part of the armed forces that went to go conquer like Central America. I mean, they were part of this process. And when I say process, they were building our homeland. And whether we like to think of it that way or not, they were building our homeland. Literally all parts of Mexican society, you'll see these stories pop up. During the Mexican War of Independence, the Mexican War of Independence was more of a civil war. It wasn't this, oh, we were like Aztec war. I mean, don't get me wrong. We have a Mexica heritage that we're very proud of in our country, but it wasn't as cut and dry as, oh, we were like these Mexica warriors in waiting for 300 years, and then we toppled the Spanish government in Mexico City. Like, that's not what happened. Like, that's kind of like a Chicano studies sort of like take on it. The Spanish colonial government in Mexico City, I mean, obviously they had a colonial army, right? The people who were in Mexico, in the Spanish military, on the Spanish side, were also born in Mexico. And they weren't all just Spanish people. They were people of all racial backgrounds. There were people who were Criollo, Mestizo, Indigenous. There were people of all backgrounds, even Afro-Mexican. Look at like how society was divided back then. Well, it wasn't a situation where it was this sort of like fly-by-night colonial military or like Spanish military coming from the peninsula to fight us. It was a civil war. It was people fighting for the future of the country. And when Mexico won its independence, it's because the colonial military switched sides. And so you see like Vicente Guerrero, right? And Agustín de Iturbide. So they ended up forming an alliance together. And together they walked into Mexico City and declared independence. So the colonial military switched sides and Spain capitulated because there was no one left to fight for Spain. So when we think of these things, like these are all of, like, all these people in the story are our ancestors.
I'll be honest in saying, you know, I know a lot about a lot of things. This is not one of those areas. So I'm not going to pretend that I do. And I know when to fold them and when to hold them. And I just simply don't know enough about this history. And I'm learning a lot. I've been reading a lot as of recent because it is interesting to me. I will say that now, correct me if I'm wrong, but now didn't Spain also was conquered at one point before they conquered Latin America, right? They were conquered by the Moors. Was it the Moors? Right. So
the Moors. Yeah.
Now, when people talk about being influenced by Spain, they don't always think about the fact that Spain was influenced by the Moors in a lot of ways, things such as horse riding, stuff like that. And you can trace that back to early cowboy culture. We can get into a conversation about that, but it's not all white Spaniards that some of these influences that they brought over. So I think that's interesting. People forget there's been so many different countries they've conquered each other along the way. They've all absorbed different aspects of each other's cultures.
One of the conquistadors that conquered Tenochtitlan was actually a person of African descent. He actually described himself as a black person. His name was Juan Garrido, and he's actually credited with, and even the Spaniards gave him credit for being the first person to plant wheat in Mexico, in the Americas, like in mainland America. He brought wheat. His name was Juan Garrido, if you want to look him up. To be clear, the indigenous people would have been better off had no one come and they had their land to themselves. Like that is clear, because there's an added layer. There wasn't just conflict, like military conflicts and truces and alliances. There were also infectious diseases. Many people died because of those infectious diseases. So to be clear, indigenous people would have been better off had no one come, but they did. And these folks are who, like, we are the result of them. And at the very least, I think it's worth folks' time to look into it and see where your roots come from. Because the thing is, with a lot of Mexican folks in general, and I think maybe even other people from other Latin American countries, they use politics in a way. They try to get you to appeal to one side of your ancestry or the other, and they use like cultural symbols to influence those things. So if they want you to be one political persuasion, like an Hispanista, like you're hardcore into like Spain and stuff like that, they'll use one set of cultural symbols. And if they want you to be an Indigenista, they'll convince you that, oh, your ancestors are, they were slaves, and the only reason why you're mixed is because everybody was violated. And it's like, that's not what I see when I do genealogy for myself or for my clients. That's just not what happened for many people. I would say most people. We have a situation where there were very few Spaniards that actually came in the very beginning. The overwhelming majority of Spaniards that ever set foot in Mexico were born in Mexico. At the time in like 1810, there were already like over 1 million people that self-identified in like census records as criollos, as españoles. Okay, those people overwhelmingly were born in Mexico, and these were people that had families. These were people that settled in communities, even in many cases away from indigenous people. The process of miscegenation really took place after independence, because in 1824, Mexico passed a constitution that eliminated racial distinctions. And so there were no privileges of being Spanish or indigenous, because you have to remember, if you were part of an indigenous community and you were like an allied indigenous community, there were privileges associated with that. I can get into that in a second. For a large segment of the population that was mixed, they were disenfranchised in both communities. Many of the people, including Vicente Guerrero, who won Mexico's independence, they were of mixed race backgrounds. So they eliminated racial distinctions altogether. And that's when you see mestizaje really take place. What was that last comment? Was that
this is a comment by David, who said smallpox was used as a weapon of war by the Spaniards. This is a fact.
Smallpox came. We actually know that this is another interesting fact of like archival research. We actually know the name of the first person that brought smallpox to Mexico. It was a guy named Francisco Eguia, and that was in 1520. And he came on the Narvaez expedition. He was actually an African slave who was infected with smallpox, and nobody knew that indigenous people had no resistance to smallpox. Like, people didn't really even understand germ warfare back then. Obviously, the Spaniards benefited in ways in military conflict because of these infectious diseases, but it also disenfranchised them in other ways, right? Because their military force was indigenous. So the same infectious diseases that impacted their enemies also impacted their allies. So I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, these diseases came as a result of Europeans, and indigenous people would have been better off had they not come.
All right. So Tokyo Drifter, kicking some knowledge here, and this is something he studied for a long time, something he finds fascinating, and it's an area that he works.